In recent times, we've seen the rise of the Metroidvanias as the indie game genre. Why do smaller games use this genre so frequently? Why is that? To start with, let's look into where the genre's name comes from. The term Metroidvania is a portmanteau of Metroid and Castlevania. Metroid being the 1986 Nintendo Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System alien-inspired horror sci-fi side-scrolling 2D platforming shooter developed and published by Nintendo. Metroid was unlike most other shooters on the platform and featured exploration and permanent item acquisition as focuses. Where in most games like Contra, when you'd pick up a power-up and move to the next area and lose a life, you'd have to start all over again without any upgrades. Metroid had a progression system, not unlike The Legend of Zelda, also by Nintendo, also from 1986. Both these games had item collection as a measure of the player's progression, where using items and solving puzzles you'd gain access to new areas. Aside from using items for puzzles and to gain access to new regions, you also had the ability to improve your player character's hit points, meaning you could take more of a beating. And you'd improve their weapon arsenal and the amount of ammunition they could carry as well. I mention this for, unlike most games with similar progression systems, you don't improve simply by leveling up and beating enemies to gain experience points. That is something we would see with the Castlevania titles, which is where the Vania in Castlevania comes from. We see the name for Akumajo Dracula and its series would be Castlevania outside of Japan. And similarly to Metroid, the Castlevania series started on Nintendo's Famicom system and Nintendo's Entertainment System in 1986, developed and published by Konami. These were universal, monster, horror-inspired side-scrolling platform games with close-range combat, where unlike Samus's laser arm found in the Metroid games, you now had Simon's whip as a close-range weapon. The first title featured linear progression, just moving from one level to the next, like the Marios, which is why most would not categorize this as a Metroidvania game as such. And the inclusion in the Metroidvania genre, it started with Castlevania Symphony of the Night on Sony's PlayStation in 1997. Originally released in Japan as a role-playing game spin-off to the more straightforward and traditional 1993 platforming title, Castlevania Rondo of Blood. 1997's Symphony of the Night and its new and improved Dracula's Castle introduced sprawling areas and the option and necessity to return to halls you've already traveled, and the acquisition of new abilities, not unlike the Metroid series of games, which now counted 3 titles. For those already deep into the Castlevania series, some of these elements we've already seen before to a greater or lesser extent in Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, only for these elements to be dropped in subsequent titles. And one of these features was the leveling up of your player character by defeating enemies and gaining experience points. And these and other features, such as the exploration, mobility of your character, and combat systems, were all expanded on in Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Having a leveling system like we would traditionally see in role-playing games such as Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and Dungeons & Dragons was one aspect that would set this game apart, would set Castlevania apart from the Metroid series, offering a constant reward for traversing the various regions of the castle, and a reason to engage in combat with the critters and demons roaming about. The presence or absence of such a system means that players are incentivized to move through the alien planets of Metroid in a vastly different way from how they traverse the castles in Castlevania. And both Metroid and Castlevania would continue into the 2000s, with new games releasing for Nintendo's handheld system, the Game Boy Advance, from 2001 to 2004, and 2 home console releases on Nintendo's GameCube from Metroid, plus 2 from Castlevania and Sony's PlayStation 2. When moving the game into a 3D space, Nintendo's Metroid series fared incredibly well, with the Retro Studios developed Metroid Prime selling more than 2.8 million units and being reviewed extremely favorably by critics with a 97 out of 100 on the review aggregate site Metacritic. Compared to the combined sales of both Castlevania games released from 2002 to 2005 for Sony's console, barely scratching 1.5 million, and an aggregate review score of them being a 79 and a 70 out of 100. It was clear where people's interests lay. Or was it? Well, the aggregate scores for the 3 handheld Castlevania titles, the ones released on the Game Boy Advance, the ones with gameplay very similar to the PlayStation title from 1997, Symphony of the Night, had aggregate scores of 91, 87, and 91 respectively, and combined they sold just over 1.5 million copies, while Metroid's 2002 Fusion title has an aggregate score of 92 and 2004's Zero Mission an 89, selling combined almost 2.4 million copies. And Metroid seemed to be the more popular series, both with their 3D innovations on the more powerful hardware of the GameCube and their traditional 2D side-scrolling titles on the weaker handheld Game Boy Advance systems. Nintendo's outings in the Metroidvania genre appeared to be what people were craving for and what they desired. But what about the non-Metroid and non-Castlevania games within the Metroidvania genre? Well, aside from Castlevania and Metroid, a number of other games in the genre were released between 2000 and 2010, where in 2004 we saw a renowned example in Cave Story. This was a tentpole title made by one singular developer in his free time, Daisuke Amaya, and released for free on Microsoft Windows. And this became a cult title, and later, with the Nintendo Wii and Nintendo 3DS releases, garnered an even greater following. Next we have Lomulana, released in 2006 for PC, and like Cave Story, this title was made by Japanese developers. It's gotten a smaller following than Cave Story, however, but it's also an important title to remember when talking classic Metroidvanias. Other than these two, we saw some elements from Metroidvania games in other titles, in 2009's Shadow Complex, for example, and 2010's Shantae Risky's Revenge, and VVV. And what do we see nowadays? What are the heavy hitters, the big dogs of this exploration-based genre? Between 2010 and 2020, we saw the Metroidvania genre starting to thrive. It was as though everyone and their mother was itching to create their own large map with color-coded keys and upgrade base progression through areas. In 2011, we had Outland and Unepic. In 2012, we saw Dust and Elysian Tale, Mark of the Ninja. 2013, Guacamelee, SteamWorld Dig. 2014, Strider the Swapper, Shantae and the Pirate's Curse, Abyss Odyssey, 2015, Ori and the Blind Forest, Environmental Station Alpha, Axiom Verge, 2016, Salt and Sanctuary, Momodora, Reverie, Under the Moonlight, Headlander, 2017, SteamWorld Dig, Hollow Knight, Sundered, A Robot Named Fight, 2018, Dead Cells, Chasm, Guacamelee 2, Time Spinner, Iconoclasts, Dandara, Yoku's Island Express, 2019, Blasphemous, Valfaris, Minoria, Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night, 2020, Shantae and the Seven Sirens, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Carry On, 2021, Skull, the Hero Slayer, Ender Lilies, Quiet as of the Night, Grime, Record of Lodos War, Deedlit, In Wonder Labyrinth, Eterna Noctis, 2022, Islets, 2023, After Image, Blasphemous 2, 2024, Prince of Persia, The Lost Crown, Nine Souls, Momodora, Moonlit Farewell, Animal Well.
That's not all, folks.
Well, let's go to the most reliable source of information, Steam. When searching the platform and using the tag Metroidvania, I get 3,597 results. I'm sure these are not all just individual title, but that's a lot more than the Castlevania, Metroid, and maybe Blaster Master of yesteryear. We now have such an enormous selection of titles in this genre, a genre that hinges completely on having good map design and well-crafted progression systems. Do things that are hard to fake, do things that take effort to implement. And a lot of the titles doing this can be seen as indie games or indie game adjacent. They're not the highest budget titles. These games don't have high budgets, and most are made by just a handful of people. Now, there's our first clue, as titles in this genre are not the most expensive to produce, where the original titles people harken back to, they didn't have the fanciest graphics and they were two-dimensional to boot. So, as a smaller studio, you're able to make such a game. All you need is some passion and an understanding of map design, interconnectivity, how one place connects to the other, and how the other connects back to the other one, but also to the first. Each area feeling part of a whole, one world, one castle. And the sales of these side-scrolling Metroid and Castlevania titles in the 2000s were not the greatest. Most people have not played them. And now we see indie games, indie Metroidvania games, capturing everyone's imagination. Is this a new subsection of society playing them? Are these new people trying out the Metroidvania genre? Well, these indie games have a quality unlike the previous ones made by these Japanese entertainment giants in Nintendo and Konami. They have a quality unlike Metroid and Castlevania, a charm, a sincerity. They are endearing. From the Microsoft-backed Ori and the Blind Forest to the self-published Hollow Knight and Guacamelees, all these titles have a cuteness, a quirkiness to their art style. They aren't afraid to tell us, we're here, we come from humble beginnings. They all have huggable character designs, made to be sellable, to be nice. We can trust Ori, the Blind Forest, Guaca, and Melee. Even Hollow Knight. Now, even if the setting is dark, the characters themselves are cute animal friends, or luchador wrestlers who, through their foreign eccentricities, are not as much of a threat as our regular old burly men. These are some examples of cuteness found within these games, and how this cuteness translates to the experience felt throughout the entirety of the game. These examples don't have pixelated art styles. However, a lot of these Metroidvania, of these indie titles do, of course. We see this pixelated style so often because of the simplicity involved, the simplicity in creation and on the processors of the developers and players' sides of things. The Salt and Sanctuaries, the Axiom Verges, and the Blasphemouses of our time. I'm not saying that these styles are easy to make or that they're not well made. They're labor intensive and they do have their charms. And through their pixel art styles, they communicate to the buyers that they are a budget-friendly game and that they do not come from these gigantic corporations. Again, playing into that endearing quality that makes indie games get a good reputation and sell well. These are two ways modern-day Metroidvania titles present themselves, and how an average consumer would perceive them when they come across them while shopping, and how publishers and developers manage to use these perceptions to their own advantage. But what makes these Metroidvanias so appealing for indie developers to create? The development costs compared to other games, as I mentioned before, is one factor. Another is the ability to present a narrative in an interactive fashion on a limited budget. One of the aspects that I failed to mention earlier is that most modern Metroidvania games resemble Castlevania titles more than they do Metroid ones. Most include a level-based progression system, where taking out foes rewards you with experience points, making you more powerful. Something never included in Metroid, but continually included in Castlevania titles that are in the style of the later Symphony of the Night. This is a type of progression we see now in many types of titles in one way or another, from Call of Duty to Fortnite to Assassin's Creed. They do not always rely on you defeating enemies, but there's always a bar increasing simply by playing the game, by doing to a greater or lesser extent what is expected from you. It's certainly very popular, and it's no surprise that it's included in these indie titles. It keeps you hooked. Your investment is constantly on the screen. Don't go away from this World of Warcraft, or your level 110 Orc Warrior will disappear. The same goes for these smaller, independently developed Metroidvania titles. Your investment in them is reliant on how much you care about their worlds, characters, and the progression within them. Having players experience progression even when not knowing how to actively continue the storyline and how to move to the next area makes them more invested. It makes us more invested. How does this tie into the narrative of a game? Well, as a player, we invest in this world, its setting, and especially the character we play as. We have no choice but to be this character. Our investment in this setting gets increased by our investment of game time. Even more so if we see it represented by an increase in power level from our player character. As players, gaining skills in this game world, we advance ourselves, while the character evolves alongside us, getting stronger. And this increases our ability to connect with them. It feels like we want them to grow and to continue, because it feels like we grow, we continue. If they die, it hurts. If they win, we celebrate. If they try to beat God or the devil and get sucked into a scheme, get trapped for eternity, we're devastated. Narratively, it makes sense to include progression of this kind. Of course, more straightforward role-playing games feature progression as well, as they've always done, and they continue to be made still, in droves, alongside the Metroidvanias. The progression system is there as part of a whole, the whole that includes exploration at its core, the pizzazz that makes these games what they are. Exploration gives off the idea of a big game, a deep game. Having many directions you can go at any given time makes players experience the game as possibly larger than it really is. When comparing the large maps of Metroidvania titles to the straight lines we see often in linear platforming games, we do not experience the world as one whole in these linearly presented titles such as Mario or Donkey Kong. After we beat one level in these games, we go to the next until we have conquered all levels, and we go on to the next world. We can go back to the same level twice, of course, but everything's reset. All coins, all bananas, they're all back. All bonus levels are ready to be unlocked again. Not in these open-ended titles, not in these Metroidvania titles. We can flick a switch in the first room of the game or grab a small upgrade to our maximum hit points, and when we return, it's still flicked, and that upgrade is still taken. With Liam Neeson. If we're wondering about the halls of our world, we move from location to location. Every room is presented as being part of this same whole. Now, we can have themed areas that present us with a particular atmosphere as well, of course. For instance, in Dracula's Castle, in the Castlevania series of games, we enter a door and Medusa heads start flying at us, and we see cogs spinning, and we travel vertically a lot. And we hear a tune very specific to this area, recognizable. We're in the clock tower. And by that tune, we know that we are in the clock tower. If we then stroll to the library and haunted books start flinging themselves at us, we know we're somewhere else. In the library. But still, we're able to walk from one place to the next, from one to the other. It makes the world feel consistent, as if it's supposed to be this way. As if we always knew the clock tower was supposed to be next to the library. It makes it feel bigger, more believable, more acceptable. What I mean to say is, this is an interconnected world. This is why people flock to the Metroidvania genre. Having a believable world on a budget. It's a nice mold to follow. We know to some extent what to expect as players, yet there's still room for experimentation from developers. And enough of a picture is already painted when the developer starts, and before they have to fill out the numbers of the canvas.
To answer the question, why is Metroidvania the indie game genre, we have to take into account the budget-friendly nature of these games, the fact that they have the ability to present a vast-feeling world to players without needing a factually enormous one, and for indie games, having characters that are sellable, harboring an image of being the underdog through the aesthetics of the various properties, the capacity of these types of games to enrapture players with their worlds, player characters, and their struggles, to make the player feel as part of the narrative, to be immersed in the game world. Again, all of this on a budget. All of these factors are to the advantage of the small studio. All of these things sell an endearing game. Thanks for watching. The final part I added on later because I felt it was a bit confusing to follow, and it just ended at some point. I thought if I add this, it makes it a bit more comprehensive and you see where I'm trying to go with this. And I think I'm a bit sick still, so it sounds slightly different than the previously recorded stuff. So yeah, there's that. And if you want to subscribe or want to comment anything, I'd love to hear from you. And I'm not feeling like doing a jokey sort of thing this time. Don't get bothered. Anyway, if you do like it, tell other people. If you have any constructive criticism, tell me. If you have any mean criticism, you can also tell me. I'll feel bad, but that's life. Anyway, if you also could have a thumbs up or thumbs down, share it on whatever platforms you have to tell people about it. That would be great. And see you all next time.